In October of 1859, a white woman named Eleanor Whitcomb made a decision that horrified even the most ruthless slaveholders in coastal Georgia. She ordered a 16-year-old enslaved girl named Seraphina chained inside a locked attic room of the main house, alone in iron restraints without sunlight. The chains weighed 34 pounds. The door was bolted with 3 locks. The windows were sealed with boards and pitch. The reason was not rebellion, not theft, not escape. It was beauty. The white society of Camden County whispered that Eleanor had lost her mind. What they did not know was why she truly did it. By the spring of 1869, 7 men would be dead, 1 plantation burned to the ground, and Eleanor Whitcomb would vanish without explanation. What really happened inside that locked room for 10 years? What did Seraphina do in the dark that terrified everyone who later learned the truth? Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The coast of Georgia in 1859 did not feel like the America preached from pulpits up north. It felt like something older and wet and watchful, an endless flat world where the sky pressed low, where the air tasted of salt and rot, and where the trees wore Spanish moss like funeral lace. Whitcomb Plantation sat a mile inland from the marsh, built on a gentle rise so the main house could pretend it was not surrounded by water and misery. The rice fields stretched outward in dull green panes, cut by narrow ditches that glittered like knives when the sun struck them. In the mornings, fog rolled in from the lowlands and wrapped everything in a pale shroud. The men who worked the waterlogged fields called it ghost smoke. They had other names for it too, names whispered rather than spoken because the marsh had a way of listening. By October, the heat should have begun to loosen its grip. But that year, summer clung like a punishment. Sweat never dried. Shirts never truly aired out. Wood stayed damp, and iron, especially iron, always felt cold even in the warmth as if it remembered the ground. Inside the main house, Eleanor Whitcomb kept the windows open only at certain hours, and never without supervision. Not because she feared thieves. Thieves were hungry men, and hungry men could be shot. What she feared was the swamp air itself, creeping in and leaving its stink on her curtains, her silver, her skin. She feared anything that reminded her she was not as separate from the world outside as she pretended. "You will close those shutters at sundown," she told the housegirl one evening, her voice smooth as polished bone. "And you will check the latches twice." "Yes'm." Eleanor stood in the front parlor with her hands folded at her waist, watching the last light bend through the live oaks and spill across the veranda boards. The oaks were enormous, their roots lifting the earth like knuckles. She sometimes thought of the plantation the way a preacher thought of a church, an institution meant to stand beyond any one life. But she also knew institutions rotted from the inside. She had seen it happen in her own bloodline. Whitcomb Plantation had not been built by her husband. It had been built by his father and enlarged by his father before him, each generation stacking wealth on top of suffering the way bricks were stacked on a foundation. There were ledgers in Eleanor's study with names written in careful ink, births, deaths, purchases, sales, entries that treated people like livestock. She could read those ledgers the way other women read novels. She knew which families had been split for profit. She knew which men had been beaten so often they no longer required a reason. She knew which girls were sent into the house because they were quiet and pretty and therefore dangerous. She knew, too, what white society required her to be. At 38, Eleanor was still spoken of as composed, dignified, a woman of proper restraint. They admired her for it, because restraint in a woman was treated like virtue. But restraint was not the same as peace. Eleanor's self-control was a weapon she used first on herself, and then on anyone who came too close. Her husband, Charles Whitcomb, spent most evenings in his study or on the veranda with a glass of brandy, watching the fields like a man watching a clock. He did not strike her. He did not shout. He did not even argue much. His indifference had a steadiness to it that sometimes felt worse than cruelty, because it made the house quiet enough for Eleanor to hear her own thoughts. That night, he glanced at her over the rim of his glass. "You have been pacing." "I have not." He looked at her shoes as if the scuff marks might testify against her. The patrollers found fresh tracks near the marsh. Eleanor's expression did not change. "Then the marsh is full of sinners. It always has been. The overseer thinks someone has been meeting out there." "Meeting?" she repeated, tasting the word. It sounded almost polite, almost human. Charles set his glass down with an unhurried clink. "If there is trouble brewing, I want it cut out at the root." Eleanor nodded once. "It will be." But what neither of them said, what even Charles could not admit out loud, was that the plantation already had a sickness in its root, and it was not born from disobedience. It was born from the simple fact that you could not trap hundreds of souls in one place, feed them fear, and expect silence forever. Down in the quarters, the night smelled of smoke, corn mush, and sweat. The cabins were packed close, rough boards patched with mud. Children lay on pallets, their bellies swollen from thin food, their eyes half open even in sleep. Women spoke in low tones while mending torn cloth. Men sat on steps, nursing sore hands, staring into the dark as if it might answer their questions. An older man named Josiah, one of the drivers trusted enough to carry messages between the field hands and the overseer, walked slowly along the lane listening. He had learned long ago that survival depended on hearing what was not said. A younger woman stepped out of a cabin and called softly, "Uncle Josiah." He stopped. "What is it?" She hesitated, then held out a small scrap of cloth. A child's ribbon, faded blue. "They got her in the big house today. The new girl." Josiah's gaze narrowed. "Which girl?" The woman swallowed. "The one they've been whispering about. The one with the face." He understood at once. Even before he had seen her, he had heard. Beauty traveled faster than truth on a plantation. It traveled like smoke. "Do not speak on it," Josiah warned, but his voice lacked heat. Warning did not erase fear. "She looked at me like she knew something," the woman said. "Like she could see the end of a thing." Josiah's throat tightened. He had seen that look before, in men about to be sold, in women watching their children taken, in old folks who sensed the grave near. It was not prophecy. It was a kind of listening. In the main house, Eleanor Whitcomb stood alone in her dressing room and removed her gloves. She stared at her own reflection for a long moment, as if searching for the place time had begun stealing from her. Candlelight softened her features, but it could not soften the truth. She was a woman in a world that valued youth like currency. From somewhere below, far below near the kitchens, came the faintest sound of laughter. A girl's laugh. Light. Unafraid. Eleanor's hands went still. She did not know it yet, but that sound would become the hinge on which the next 10 years turned. And none of them, neither Eleanor in her silk nor Josiah in the dirt, understood that the house was already making room for chains, because some prisons were built long before the locks were ever turned. Seraphina had been born in the early spring of 1843, when the rice fields were still bare and the marsh birds screamed through the dawn like something torn open. Her mother, Lilla, went into labor in the dark of a cabin that smelled of boiled roots and wet earth. There was no midwife summoned from another plantation, no white doctor riding in with clean hands and silver tools. Lilla delivered her own child with the help of 2 women and a prayer spoken so quietly it sounded like breath. When the baby came, she did not cry right away. For a moment that felt too long, everyone froze. Then the child opened her eyes, wide, dark, already searching, and let out a thin, cutting wail that made one of the women whisper, "Lord have mercy." Lilla named her Seraphina after a word she had once heard a preacher use to describe angels. She did not know its meaning exactly, only that it sounded like fire wrapped in light. She held the child close, counting fingers, counting toes, afraid that if she looked away the world might remember what it was allowed to take. Seraphina grew quietly. She did not fuss the way other babies did. She watched. From the time she could sit upright, she followed motion with her eyes. The sway of moss, the drift of smoke, the hands of women moving through chores. People said she was strange. People always said that about children who did not beg for attention. By the time she was 6, it was already clear she would not be sent to the fields. The overseer noticed first. Then the mistress. She carried water without spilling it. She learned to sew straight seams with little correction. She did not argue. She did not rush. And when she walked, she moved as if she were listening to something beneath her feet. "What is that child's name?" Eleanor Whitcomb asked one afternoon, watching from the shade as Seraphina crossed the yard with a basket balanced on her hip. "Seraphina, ma'am," the housekeeper replied. "Belongs to Lilla's line." Eleanor studied the girl's profile, the curve of her cheek, the calm set of her mouth. There was nothing indecent about it, nothing exaggerated. But the whole of her face held together in a way that unsettled Eleanor, as if nature had been too careful. "She will work inside," Eleanor said. It was not a suggestion. Lilla wept the night Seraphina was taken from the quarters. She did not weep loudly. Loud grief attracted attention. She wept into the dirt behind her cabin, pressing her forehead into the earth as if trying to push herself back into it. "Mind your eyes," she told her daughter before the housekeeper led her away. "Do not look too long at nothing." Seraphina nodded. She did not ask why. Inside the main house, the floors were cool and smooth. The ceilings rose high enough to make voices echo. Seraphina learned quickly which boards creaked, which doors should never be opened without permission, which rooms were meant only to be dusted, never entered fully. She learned that white people liked to believe silence meant obedience, when in truth it often meant calculation. The other house servants noticed her before Eleanor did. "She ain't right," whispered a girl named Ruth, watching Seraphina polish silver. "She don't move like us." "She don't move like she's scared," another replied. "That's what you mean." Men noticed her too, though they pretended not to. Eyes lingered. Smiles grew awkward. Some laughed too loudly in her presence, as if noise might cover thought. Seraphina did not flirt. She did not smile back. She carried herself as if her body belonged to her alone, which in that place was its own kind of defiance. Eleanor watched all of it from a distance at first. She told herself she was merely observant, that she was doing what a mistress ought, monitoring the behavior of her household. But the truth pressed closer each day. Seraphina unsettled her because she made visible something Eleanor had spent her life denying. Youth did not ask permission. One evening, Eleanor summoned the housekeeper. "The girl, Seraphina," she said, adjusting her shawl. "She is to keep her hair bound at all times." "Yes'm." "And she will not speak unless spoken to." "Yes'm." "And she will no longer serve in the front rooms when guests are present." The housekeeper hesitated. "Ma'am?" Eleanor's eyes lifted. The hesitation died. "She distracts," Eleanor said. "That is reason enough." The restrictions multiplied quietly. No mirrors, no ribbons, no lingering near doorways. Seraphina accepted each rule without protest, which only deepened Eleanor's unease. Resistance could be punished. Acceptance was harder to control. At night, Seraphina lay on her narrow pallet beneath the slanted ceiling of the servants' quarters inside the house and listened. The walls carried sound differently there. She learned the cadence of Eleanor's steps, the way Charles Whitcomb cleared his throat before speaking, the muffled sobs of a maid 2 rooms down who missed a child sold south. Seraphina dreamed often of water. Not drowning, floating. In her dreams, chains sank while she stayed near the surface, watching light ripple above her. She did not know why she dreamed these things. She only knew they left her calm when she woke. Down in the quarters, Lilla watched the main house from a distance and felt something tightening inside her chest. Mothers learned to recognize danger the way animals recognize storms, through pressure, through the wrongness of the air. "She ain't safe there," Lilla whispered to Josiah one evening. Josiah did not answer right away. He stared toward the rise where the White House stood, its windows glowing like eyes. "No," he said finally. "But safety been a lie since the day she was born." Above them all, Eleanor Whitcomb sat at her vanity, unpinning her hair. She caught her reflection again and again, each glance sharper than the last. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Eleanor froze, listening. What she did not yet understand was that fear had already chosen its object, and it was not the girl. It was what the girl represented. And soon, fear would demand a cage. Eleanor Whitcomb began to notice Seraphina the way one noticed a stain spreading beneath clean cloth, slowly at first, then all at once. It was not a single moment, not one act of disobedience or impertinence. It was accumulation. A look held half a second too long. A silence that felt deliberate rather than empty. A presence that refused to shrink. At breakfast, Eleanor would lift her teacup and feel eyes on her, only to look up and find Seraphina standing motionless near the sideboard, waiting to be dismissed. The girl never stared outright. She did not need to. Her awareness seemed to fill the room without effort, like heat. "You may go," Eleanor said one morning, sharper than necessary. Seraphina inclined her head and left without a sound. Charles glanced up from his paper. "You spoke as if she had done something." "She has," Eleanor replied. "What?" Eleanor did not answer. There were some things she could not yet put into words because words made them real. And if they were real, then she might be required to examine her own part in them. The house itself seemed to change as Eleanor's attention narrowed. Shadows felt heavier. Hallways felt longer. Mirrors, once merely reflective, began to feel accusatory. Eleanor ordered several removed from guest rooms under the pretense of redecorating. One mirror in particular, a tall oval piece brought from Savannah years earlier, had begun to trouble her. It caught angles too well. It remembered her younger face. She had it taken down and placed in storage. "You will keep her away from the gentleman," Eleanor told the housekeeper after a Sunday supper attended by 2 neighboring planters. "I saw the way Mr. Harlan watched her pour wine." "Yes'm." "And the way she carried herself, did you see it?" The housekeeper hesitated. She carried the tray steady, ma'am. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her fan. Do not pretend ignorance. The housekeeper lowered her gaze. Pretending ignorance was, in fact, her profession. What Eleanor did not say, what she could not say, was that she recognized something in the men's eyes when Seraphina passed. Not lust alone. Something closer to hunger mixed with shame. A wanting that embarrassed them because it reminded them they were still animals beneath their linen and manners. It reminded Eleanor too. At night, Eleanor dreamed of the girl standing at the foot of her bed, chains loose in her hands, smiling gently as if in apology. Eleanor always woke before the girl spoke, heart racing, the taste of iron in her mouth. She began to test Seraphina in small ways. You, she said one afternoon, gesturing sharply. Come here. Seraphina approached, eyes lowered. Look at me. Seraphina lifted her gaze. For a fraction of a second, something passed between them. Not defiance. Not submission. Recognition. Eleanor felt it like a slap. You are aware of the effect you have, Eleanor said quietly. Seraphina said nothing. Answer me. I do not know what you mean, ma'am. The lie was gentle, almost kind. Eleanor's lips thinned. You will keep your eyes lowered in my presence at all times. Yes, ma'am. And you will speak only when addressed. Yes, ma'am. And you will remember your place. Seraphina hesitated, not long enough to be called disobedience, but long enough to be noticed. Then she nodded. Yes, ma'am. That hesitation replayed in Eleanor's mind long after the girl had gone. It echoed through her thoughts while she sat with her embroidery untouched in her lap. While she ate. While she prayed. She began to imagine conversations that had never happened. Glances that might have been exchanged. Laughter that could not possibly have been meant for her ears, yet felt directed at her all the same. Jealousy, Eleanor told herself, was an ugly word used by vulgar people. What she felt was vigilance. Protection of order. Down in the quarters, Josiah noticed the change before most. The girl Ruth whispered it to him first. The mistress been watching her, Ruth said. Watching like she counting something. Counting what? Josiah asked. Ruth shook her head. Don't know. But it ain't numbers. Josiah felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He had seen this pattern before, though never quite like this. Desire usually made men careless. Fear made women cruel. One evening, Eleanor called Charles into the parlor. I want the girl removed from general service, she said. Charles frowned. Removed how? Confined to specific duties. Laundry. Storage rooms. Places unseen. She has done nothing wrong. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. She has done too much right. Charles studied her for a moment as if seeing her from a distance for the first time. You are troubled. I am responsible. For what? For this house. For what it represents. Charles sighed and looked away. He did not want to argue. He rarely did. Do as you see fit. That was all the permission Eleanor needed. Restrictions became routine. Seraphina's world shrank by degrees. Doorways closed. Tasks were reassigned. She was kept away from windows, from visitors, from anything that reflected light. Still, the sense of threat did not fade. One night, Eleanor heard singing. It was soft. Almost a hum. It drifted up through the floorboards while Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The sound was not mournful. It was not joyful either. It was steady. Intentional. Eleanor sat up, heart pounding. She rang the bell for a servant. Yes'm? Who is singing? The servant hesitated. No one, ma'am. Eleanor's voice sharpened. Do not lie to me. The servant swallowed. It might be the girl, Seraphina. She hums sometimes while she works. Tell her to stop. Yes'm. The humming ceased. The silence that followed felt louder than the sound had been. Eleanor lay back down, but sleep did not come. Her mind kept circling one thought again and again, like a finger probing a sore tooth. The beauty was power, and power always corrupted. Then what did it mean to allow such beauty to remain unrestrained? By morning, Eleanor had decided. What she did not yet know was that obsession, once given purpose, no longer needed justification. And when fear dressed itself as morality, it could demand almost anything, even chains. And soon, Eleanor Whitcomb would begin to convince herself that she was not committing a cruelty. She was preventing one. The accusation came on a Tuesday morning, carried into the house like a tray of porcelain. Handled carefully, presented politely, and already cracked. Eleanor Whitcomb did not raise her voice when she summoned the overseer and the housekeeper to the small sitting room off the rear hall. She did not pace. She did not wring her hands. She sat very straight in a high-backed chair, her gloves folded in her lap, her expression arranged into something that resembled regret. "I have reason to believe," she said, "that impropriety has taken place within my household." The overseer, Mr. Grady, shifted his weight. He was a broad man with a sunburned neck and a face accustomed to giving orders, not receiving veiled ones. "Impropriety how, ma'am?" Eleanor let a paw stretch. She had learned the value of silence from watching men use it like a cudgel. "There have been attentions," she said at last. "Uninvited. Unseemly." The housekeeper's eyes flickered toward the floor. "From whom?" Grady asked. Eleanor lifted her gaze. "From the girl. Seraphina." The name landed heavily in the room. Grady frowned. "The girl? She barely speaks." "Precisely," Eleanor replied. "Such behavior often thrives in secrecy." The housekeeper drew in a careful breath. "Ma'am, begging your pardon, but I have never seen." Eleanor raised a hand, palm outward. The housekeeper fell silent. "There have been looks," Eleanor continued. "Lingering glances. Positioning of the body meant to invite notice. I have seen it with my own eyes." Grady hesitated. "Men do the looking, ma'am." Eleanor's smile was thin. "Men are weak. Women and girls know this. Some exploit it." The words sounded rehearsed because they were. Eleanor had practiced them in her head, testing their weight until they felt solid enough to carry blame. "Which men?" Grady asked. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "That is not the point. I will not allow the reputation of my household, or my neighbors, to be endangered by a girl who does not know her place." The housekeeper spoke again softly. "What would you have us do, ma'am?" Eleanor stood. The movement was deliberate, ceremonial. "Remove her from general service immediately. She will be confined to a private space until further notice." "Confined?" Grady repeated. "For her own protection," Eleanor said smoothly, "and for the protection of others." No one argued. Not because they agreed, but because Eleanor Whitcomb's authority in that house was absolute, and because accusations, once spoken, had a way of becoming truth simply through repetition. Seraphina was folding linens when they came for her. Two men stood in the doorway, Grady and another overseer. Neither met her eyes. "Come with us," Grady said. Seraphina looked from one to the other. "Where?" "You have been accused of misconduct." The word sounded foreign in her mouth when she tried to understand it. "What kind?" Grady did not answer. He did not need to. On a plantation, explanation was a courtesy rarely extended. She followed them through the back corridors of the house, past rooms she had cleaned but never entered fully. Her heart beat steadily. Fear had not yet found its shape. They brought her before Eleanor in the same small sitting room. "Do you know why you are here?" Eleanor asked. Seraphina stood with her hands folded, eyes lowered as instructed. "No, ma'am. You have been behaving in a manner unfit for a girl in your position." Seraphina lifted her gaze despite herself. "I have done my work." "That is not all a girl does," Eleanor said sharply. "Do not pretend innocence." Seraphina's brow furrowed. "I do not understand." Eleanor leaned forward. "Do not insult me by feigning ignorance. You know exactly how you conduct yourself. The looks, the pauses, the way you move through rooms as if you were invited." A long silence followed. Then Seraphina spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I walk where I am told." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "You enjoy the attention." "No, ma'am. You enjoy being seen." Seraphina shook her head once. "I do not ask to be seen." The words struck Eleanor harder than any denial could have. They suggested a truth Eleanor could not bear, that the attention Seraphina received was not something she created, but something others brought with them. Eleanor rose abruptly. "Enough." She turned to Grady. "Take her away." "Where?" Seraphina asked. Eleanor did not answer her. She addressed the room. "She will be kept apart. Away from temptation. Away from corruption." Seraphina's mouth opened, then closed. She looked past Eleanor just for a moment toward the door. Toward the rest of the house she would no longer be allowed to exist within. Down in the quarters word spread quickly. Accusations always did. "They say she'd been luring men," Ruth whispered. "Luring?" Another woman spat. "Child, don't even lift her eyes." Josiah listened without comment. His jaw tightened. He had heard this story too many times. The details changed. The ending rarely did. That evening, Eleanor stood alone at the foot of the narrow staircase that led to the attic. It was a space used mostly for storage. Old furniture, trunks of clothing, things no longer wanted but not yet discarded. The air up there was stale, unvisited. She placed her hand on the banister. The wood felt rough beneath her glove. "This is necessary," she murmured to herself. "This is mercy." Above her, the attic waited. What no one else knew, what Eleanor herself barely acknowledged, was that she had already decided how far she would go. The accusation had not been a question. It had been a door. And once opened, it would not be easily closed. Because when fear finally finds a name, it demands proof. And Eleanor Whitcomb was prepared to supply it. They came for Seraphina after midnight, when the house had settled into the shallow sleep of heat and exhaustion. The air was thick enough to press against the lungs. Even the insects had quieted, as if something in the night had warned them to listen. Seraphina woke before the door opened. She had learned the sounds of the house too well, the way footsteps changed when they carried purpose, the way keys betrayed themselves with the smallest clink. She sat up on her pallet just as the lock turned. Grady entered first, carrying a lantern. 2 men followed, their faces already closed to whatever this was about to require of them. "Get up," Grady said. Seraphina stood. She did not ask where they were taking her. Some answers arrived only after the asking was done. They led her through the back corridors, past sleeping servants who would swear later they heard nothing. The house smelled different at night, less of soap and starch, more of old wood and secrets. The staircase to the attic creaked beneath their weight, each step sounding too loud, too final. The attic door stood open. Inside, the space was narrow and slanted, the ceiling pressing down like a warning. A single lantern hung from a beam, casting long shadows across stacked trunks and discarded furniture. Dust floated thick in the air. The heat was suffocating. Seraphina took it in at a glance and understood. Eleanor Whitcomb stood near the far wall, dressed in a dark wrapper, her hair pinned tightly back. In her hands she held something that caught the lantern light and threw it back cold. Chains. Iron links, thick and heavy, coiled like a waiting animal. Grady cleared his throat. "Ma'am, once this is done." "It will be done properly," Eleanor said. Her voice did not shake. And quietly, she looked at Seraphina. "This is for your own good." Seraphina's mouth went dry. "What have I done?" "You have existed improperly," Eleanor replied. "And that is something I cannot allow." One of the men stepped forward and reached for Seraphina's arm. She did not pull away at first. She looked at Eleanor instead, searching for something, hesitation, doubt, any sign that this was a mistake that might still be corrected. She found none. When the iron touched her skin, she flinched. The metal was colder than she expected, cold enough to steal breath. The cuff closed around her wrist with a sound that seemed to echo far beyond the attic walls. "No," she said. It was not a scream. It was a statement. A boundary. "Hold her," Eleanor snapped. Hands seized her arms. The second cuff closed. Then the chain at her ankles. Each link was measured, deliberate. 34 pounds of iron, weighed earlier that evening by Eleanor herself. "This will keep you from harming anyone," Eleanor said, as if explaining a lesson. Seraphina's heart pounded. Panic rose sharp and sudden, but beneath it was something else, an understanding settling into place with terrible clarity. This was not punishment meant to end. This was containment. "Please," one of the men muttered, not to Seraphina but to Eleanor. "This is enough," Eleanor said. "Leave us." Grady hesitated. "Ma'am?" "I said leave." The men filed out, eyes averted. The door closed behind them with a heavy finality. Eleanor slid the first bolt into place. Then the second. Then the third. The sound of each lock was distinct. Seraphina stood in the lantern light, chained, breathing fast. "You will kill me." Eleanor turned. "No. I will preserve you." "For what?" Eleanor did not answer. She did not need to. The answer was written in her eyes, fear sharpened into resolve. "You will stay here," Eleanor said. "You will be fed. You will be given water. You will be safe from corrupting others. And from the sun," Seraphina said softly. Eleanor paused. "You will not require it." She extinguished the lantern. Darkness swallowed the room instantly. The door closed. The lock slid home. Seraphina screamed then, not because she believed it would bring help, but because silence would have meant surrender. The sound struck the walls and came back to her broken, unfamiliar. It did not travel down the house. The attic was built to keep things in. Downstairs, Eleanor leaned against the door for a moment, her chest rising and falling. "It is done," she whispered. She returned to her room and lay awake until dawn, listening for sounds that did not come. In the days that followed, Eleanor told herself she was calm. She issued instructions with precision. Food twice daily. Water checked. No one to speak to the girl. No one to linger near the attic stairs. She is ill, Eleanor told anyone who asked. Delicate. She must be kept quiet. Rumors spread anyway. Locked up, someone whispered. Gone mad, another said. Lila felt it before she heard it. Mothers always did. They took her, Ruth said, eyes wide. She ain't in the house no more. Lila's knees gave out beneath her. Josiah caught her before she fell. Where? Lila gasped. Ruth shook her head. Don't know. But I heard screaming in the night. Up in the attic, Seraphina lay on the floor, chains biting into her wrists and ankles. The darkness was complete. Time lost its shape. She counted breaths until counting failed. She pressed her cheek to the floor and felt the faint vibration of footsteps below, life continuing without her. At some point she stopped screaming, not because she had been broken, but because she had begun to listen. The house spoke in its own language, wood shifting, beams settling, distant voices rising and falling. Seraphina learned the rhythm of it the way a sailor learned the sea. What Eleanor Whitcomb did not know, what she would not learn until much later, was that confinement did not erase Seraphina's presence. It concentrated it. And in the dark, with nothing but time and iron and breath, Seraphina began to change in ways no one had planned for. Because some cages do not weaken what they hold. They sharpen it. Time did not pass in the attic the way it passed in the rest of the world. There were no windows to mark the day, no bells to divide hours, no seasons to announce themselves with ceremony. There was only heat that swelled and retreated, cold that crept in during winter nights, and hunger that arrived on schedule like a cruel promise kept. At first, Seraphina counted. She counted heartbeats. She counted breaths. She counted the steps Eleanor's shoes made on the floor below, learned the difference between the mistress's measured pace and the quicker tread of servants sent unwillingly up the stairs with a tray. She counted the clink of the latch. She counted the spoonfuls of thin stew poured into a chipped bowl and the sips of water rationed carefully, as if mercy itself had weight and cost. Do not speak to her, Eleanor instructed the servants. She must rest. Some obeyed strictly. Others could not bear the silence. I am sorry, a young maid whispered once, setting the tray down just beyond Seraphina's reach. Her hands trembled. I ain't allowed to stay. Seraphina nodded. She did not waste words on those who were already afraid. The chains rubbed her skin raw in the early months. Her wrists bled. Her ankles swelled. When infection came, it came quietly like a negotiation. Fever blurred her thoughts. She lay on the floor and let the heat take her, drifting in and out of sleep so deep it felt like falling through water. She survived. When she could sit again, she learned how to shift her weight to ease the pull of iron. She learned how to sleep in pieces. She learned that pain, if met without panic, dulled eventually into something she could carry. The darkness did not frighten her for long. Darkness was honest. It did not pretend to be kind. What frightened her were the sounds that reached her through the floor, the muffled laughter of dinners, the clink of glass, the music of a piano played badly by a visiting niece. Life continued inches away, and it continued deliberately, as if the house itself were proving a point. Seraphina listened. She listened to Eleanor's voice most of all. It changed over the years. At first, it was firm, controlled. Then it sharpened, grew brittle. Later still, it began to crack around the edges, especially late at night, when Eleanor spoke to herself without realizing she was being overheard. This was necessary, Eleanor would murmur, pacing. I could not allow corruption. Other times there were tears. Eleanor never wept loudly. She wept the way people with pride always did, contained, furious with themselves for needing release. Seraphina marked these moments and stored them away. Food came less regularly as time went on. Sometimes a day passed. Sometimes two. Once three. Eleanor claimed the girl was fasting for her health. The lie hardened with use. Down in the quarters, Lila aged quickly. Grief bent her spine. She asked questions she knew would never be answered. She left offerings of bread near the back of the house when she could, whispering her daughter's name into the night as if it might carry upward. Seraphina, she breathed. Live. Up in the attic, Seraphina dreamed less as the years went on. When she did dream, the dreams were sharp, almost instructional. She dreamed of walking through the house unseen. She dreamed of doors opening themselves. She dreamed of Eleanor kneeling on the attic floor, begging. When she woke, she was calm. She began to sing, not loudly, not at first. Just enough to feel the vibration in her chest, to remind herself that her voice still belonged to her. The songs were not hymns exactly. They were fragments stitched together from memory and invention. Tunes her mother had hummed. Rhythms learned from footsteps. Eleanor heard it one night and screamed for silence. "Make her stop," she shouted, voice cracking. "Make her stop." The singing stopped. Not because Seraphina had been cowed. Because she had learned when sound mattered, and when silence did more work. Years passed. The Civil War came and went like a storm heard from a great distance. News arrived in pieces, carried on anxious whispers and drunken boasts. Men left the plantation and did not return. Rice fields lay untended. Well thinned. Eleanor aged rapidly, her hair streaking gray, her hands shaking when she poured tea. Through it all, the attic remained locked. No one could say exactly how long Seraphina had been there. Years? 9. Eleanor stopped counting because numbers implied an end. One winter, a rat found its way into the attic. It skittered across the floor and froze when it sensed her. Seraphina watched it, curious rather than afraid. Hunger made strange companions. "You can stay," she whispered. The rat did. It became proof that even in cages, life adapted. By the time 10 years had passed, Seraphina's body had changed. She was thinner, harder. Her muscles had learned economy. Her eyes saw more in darkness than they ever had in light. Pain had become a familiar language, one she spoke fluently. What Eleanor Whitcomb never understood, what she could not have understood without acknowledging her own cruelty, was that isolation did not erase identity. It distilled it. Seraphina had been stripped of everything except awareness. And awareness, sharpened over years of listening, had become something dangerous. By the spring of 1869, Eleanor Whitcomb would stand at the attic door with trembling hands and realize too late that she had not been guarding the world from Seraphina. She had been guarding Seraphina from the world. And the world, impatient after 10 years, was about to come crashing in. By the time the 10th year approached its end, Whitcomb Plantation no longer felt like a place anchored to the earth. It felt unmoored, as if it were drifting slowly away from the rules that had once governed it. The war had stripped the house of certainty. Emancipation had hollowed out the old hierarchies without fully replacing them. And Eleanor Whitcomb, once so rigid in her control, now moved through her own home like a guest afraid of overstaying her welcome. The servants, no longer enslaved by law, though still bound by poverty and habit, whispered openly now. They spoke of doors opening on their own. Of footsteps heard in corridors no one walked anymore. Of a presence that seemed to pass through rooms just after midnight, when the house should have been still. "It's the attic," Ruth said one evening, her voice low. "Something up there ain't right." Josiah nodded slowly. He had felt it too. The house breathed differently now. The walls creaked with intention, not age. "Places where pain sits too long don't stay quiet," he said. "They remember." Eleanor remembered as well, though she would never have admitted it. She slept poorly, waking drenched in sweat, her heart racing as if she had been called by name. Some nights she dreamed of chains dragging across the floor. Other nights, she dreamed of mirrors returning to the house, lining the hallway so that every direction reflected her face back at her, older and older with each step. She began to drink earlier in the day. "Ma'am," the housekeeper ventured once, "perhaps it would be best if—" "If what?" Eleanor snapped. "If the girl were examined by a doctor." Eleanor's laugh was sharp. "So that he may see her too?" The housekeeper fell silent. Eleanor could not explain the way her skin prickled when she passed beneath the attic stairs. She avoided that part of the house whenever possible, rerouting herself like a woman avoiding a graveyard. And yet, she found herself drawn there at night, standing at the bottom of the stairs, listening. Sometimes she swore she heard breathing above her. Not labored, not weak, steady. "You should be dead," Eleanor whispered once, the words escaping before she could stop them. There was no answer. Or perhaps there was, in the form of a sound so faint Eleanor could not be sure it was real, a soft shift like iron settling. Visitors noticed the change in Eleanor before they noticed the house. "You look unwell," a cousin remarked during a rare afternoon call. "I am managing," Eleanor replied stiffly. But managing was not the same as ruling. The overseers came less often now. The books went untended. The plantation, once a machine of profit, ran unevenly, powered by inertia rather than command. And still the attic door remained locked. One evening, a former field hand named Thomas, newly free, newly bold, drank too much and spoke too loudly. "There's a woman in that house," he said, slurring slightly. "Been there 10 years. Ruth hissed at him to stop. Josiah grabbed his arm. "You don't know what you're saying." Thomas pulled free. "I know what I heard. Screams. Singing. That ain't no ghost. The rumor spread beyond the plantation after that. Neighbors whispered. A traveling preacher mentioned it in prayer, speaking vaguely of hidden sins and locked rooms. Eleanor heard about it and felt something inside her snap tight. They will not take this from me, she told herself. They will not undo what I have done. But even as she said it, she felt the ground shifting beneath her certainty. Up in the attic, Seraphina felt the change as clearly as weather. The house was restless. Voices below rose in pitch, in anger and fear. New footsteps sounded on the stairs, hesitant ones, unfamiliar ones. Doors were left open longer. Food came irregularly, sometimes forgotten entirely, then delivered in a rush of guilty efficiency. Seraphina no longer needed to count time. Her body knew when years had passed. The iron had become part of her awareness, its weight mapped into her bones. She could tell when someone stood directly beneath her. She could tell when Eleanor approached the stairs, her steps lighter now, uncertain. Once, late at night, Seraphina heard Eleanor speaking clearly, directly upward as if addressing the ceiling. "You do not know what you are," Eleanor said. "You do not know what you would have become." Seraphina smiled in the dark. Another night, there were footsteps on the stairs that did not retreat. Keys jingled. The first lock turned, then stopped. Eleanor's breathing was ragged on the other side of the door. "I should never have listened," Eleanor whispered, to God, to herself, to the thing she feared most. "I should have ended this." Her hand fell away. The locks remained. Downstairs, Josiah stood by the back door and felt a certainty settle into him like a stone. "This house ain't finished," he said quietly. "Not yet." By the spring of 1869, tension coiled through Whitcomb Plantation like a drawn wire. People moved quickly, spoke carefully, slept lightly. They sensed what Eleanor refused to name, that whatever had been locked away for 10 years was no longer contained. And soon the house would demand an accounting, because structures built on silence always do. And when the reckoning came, it would not begin with a scream. It would begin with a door opening. The first death was not announced by a scream or a gunshot. It arrived the way rot did, quietly, patiently, and undeniable once discovered. His name was Matthew Harlan, a distant cousin of the neighbor who had once watched Seraphina pour wine too carefully. He came to Whitcomb Plantation in late May of 1869, riding in on a borrowed horse with papers in his satchel and confidence in his posture. He claimed to be assessing land values for a potential purchase. He drank Eleanor's tea and spoke of opportunity as if opportunity were something that belonged to him by inheritance. Eleanor listened with a brittle politeness. She watched his eyes drift, toward the staircase, toward the upper halls, toward nothing in particular and everything at once. "You have an attic," Harlan said casually, setting his cup down. "Older houses usually do." "Yes," Eleanor replied. "It is not in use." "Shame," he said, smiling. "And used spaces have a way of hiding value." The word hiding tightened Eleanor's chest. That evening, Harlan stayed for supper. He drank too much. He laughed too loudly. When Eleanor retired early, citing a headache, he lingered in the parlor with a bottle of brandy and the comfortable assumption that the house, like everything else, would eventually open to him. Upstairs, Seraphina listened. She heard his boots on the stairs, heavy, confident, unfamiliar. She heard the pause at the landing, the testing of doors, the curiosity that smelled like entitlement. When the first lock on the attic door turned, she felt it through the floor, through the chain, through the bones of the house itself. The second lock followed. Then the third. The door opened. Light spilled into the attic for the first time in years. It cut across dust and iron and skin that had not known sun. Seraphina shielded her eyes, blinking, her heart steady in a way that would have surprised her younger self. "Well," Harlan said softly, "so it's true." He stepped inside, lantern raised, taking her in slowly. The chains. The hollowed cheeks. The eyes that watched him without fear. "Good God," he murmured. "She kept you." Seraphina said nothing. Harlan set the lantern down and approached. "You must be starved." He reached out. Seraphina moved then, not suddenly, not violently. She shifted her weight, the chain sliding with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. Harlan hesitated, his confidence faltering. "You do not need to be afraid," he said, though his voice betrayed him. "I am not here to hurt you." Seraphina met his gaze fully for the first time since the door opened. "Then leave." Harlan laughed, uneasy. "You do not understand." The iron spoke before she did. She had learned the length of her chain over years of testing, the exact reach of her body when pulled tight. When Harlan stepped closer, she pivoted, wrapping the chain around his wrist with a practiced motion that owed nothing to panic and everything to preparation. "What?" he began. She yanked. Harlan stumbled forward, the lantern tipping, light spinning wildly across the attic walls. He crashed to the floor, breath exploding from his lungs. Seraphina did not hesitate. She had imagined this moment so many times it felt like memory. The chain tightened around his throat. Harlan clawed at it, gasping, his boots scraping uselessly against the floor. Seraphina leaned back, using her weight, her years, her patience. The iron did what iron was meant to do. When it was over, she did not move for a long time. Downstairs, Eleanor woke to a sound she could not place, a dull thud followed by silence. She sat up in bed, heart racing, listening. Nothing followed. She told herself it was the house settling. The house had been doing that a lot lately. Morning came. Harlan did not appear for breakfast. A search was organized by mid-morning, prompted by his abandoned horse and Eleanor's forced concern. Grady and 2 others climbed the attic stairs reluctantly, keys shaking in the overseer's hand. The door opened. The lantern revealed the body first. The face purpled. The eyes staring. The chain still wrapped tight. Grady retched. "Oh Christ," one man whispered. "What happened?" Seraphina stood in the corner, chains slack now, her expression unreadable. "She killed him," Grady said, though the words lacked certainty. "She?" "No," Eleanor said, her voice sharp, cutting through the chaos. She stood in the doorway, pale but composed. "He broke in. He attacked her." Grady looked at her, startled. "Ma'am?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "He broke into my home. He found this." He paid for his curiosity. The men exchanged glances. They did not like it, but they understood it. Dead men complicated things. Explanations simplified them. By evening, a story had been agreed upon. Harlan had fallen. An accident. A thief. A tragedy unfortunate but unremarkable in unsettled times. The body was removed quietly. The attic door was locked again. That night, Eleanor stood alone at the bottom of the stairs, staring upward. Her hands trembled. "You see what you have done," she whispered. Above her, Seraphina sat in the dark, listening to the house exhale. The first death changed everything. It proved what Eleanor had feared and denied in equal measure, that what she had locked away had not been weakened. It had been waiting. And now that waiting was over. Because once blood had been spilled, the house would not be satisfied with silence again. It would demand more. After the first death, Whitcomb Plantation did not return to its routines. It performed them. Meals were served. Doors were locked. Accounts were written in careful hand. But beneath the performance ran a current of fear that made every ordinary act feel rehearsed. Eleanor Whitcomb did not sleep at all the night Matthew Harlan's body was taken away. She sat at her vanity until dawn, staring at her reflection as if it might finally accuse her. When morning came, she rose and dressed with deliberate precision, choosing a high-collared black gown that made her look narrower, harder, almost severe enough to justify what had happened. She told herself again the story she had chosen. He broke in. He attacked. The girl defended herself. The story was thin, but it was serviceable. Serviceable stories were often the most dangerous. By midday, Eleanor could no longer remain away from the stairs. She dismissed the servants and moved through the house alone, her steps slow, measured, as if each one were a decision she might still undo. The keys felt heavier in her hand than they ever had. Iron remembered its uses. At the foot of the attic staircase, she stopped. "This ends today," she said aloud to no one. It must. The climb felt longer than before. Each step creaked under her weight, announcing her presence with a betrayal she could not silence. At the door, she paused, her hand hovering over the first lock. "Seraphina?" she called. There was no answer. Eleanor swallowed and turned the key. The lock opened easily. So did the second. At the third, her hand shook badly enough that she had to steady it against the doorframe. When the door swung open, light spilled into the attic once more, but this time Eleanor did not step back from what it revealed. Seraphina stood near the center of the room, chains still on her wrists and ankles, her posture upright, composed. She looked older than Eleanor remembered, not in years but in presence. The girl Eleanor had locked away had been contained by fear. The woman before her was contained by nothing. "You killed him," Eleanor said, her voice thin. "He entered without permission," Seraphina replied. "You taught me that matters." Eleanor flinched. "Do not twist my words." "I learned them," Seraphina said calmly. "I learned all of them." Eleanor stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The sound echoed. "You think this gives you power?" Eleanor said. One death does not change what you are. Seraphina tilted her head slightly. What am I? Eleanor hesitated. For 10 years she had avoided that question by replacing it with rules, chains, and lies. Now it demanded an answer. You are dangerous, Eleanor said at last. Seraphina considered this. You made me that. No, Eleanor snapped. You were always this way. You drew attention. You corrupted men. I did not ask them to look, Seraphina said. But you noticed that too, did you not? Eleanor's breath caught. I noticed a threat. A mirror, Seraphina said softly. The word struck Eleanor like a blow. You think yourself innocent, Seraphina continued. You think fear makes cruelty righteous. But you listened to me for 10 years whether you meant to or not. You learned me the way I learned you. Eleanor took another step forward. You will be moved. Quietly. Somewhere no one will find you. Seraphina smiled then just slightly. You no longer control where I am. Eleanor laughed, sharp and brittle. You are chained. And you are trembling, Seraphina said. Silence stretched between them, thick with things finally spoken. You do not understand what will happen if this comes out, Eleanor said. They will destroy what is left of this house. They should, Seraphina replied. It was built to destroy. Eleanor's eyes filled, and for a moment the mask slipped entirely. I was afraid, she whispered. Do you know what it is to grow old and invisible? Seraphina watched her without softness or hatred. I know what it is to be seen and buried alive. The truth settled between them like dust. Eleanor straightened. Whatever fragile confession had surfaced was quickly buried again beneath pride. You will not leave this place, she said. Not alive. She reached into her pocket and drew out a small pistol, its barrel catching the light. Seraphina did not move. Eleanor raised the weapon, her hands shaking violently now. I will not be undone by you. You already are, Seraphina said. You just have not admitted it. Eleanor pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. The click sounded impossibly loud in the small space. Seraphina moved. She stepped forward, chain snapping taut, wrapping around Eleanor's wrist as it had with Harlan. Eleanor screamed, dropping the pistol. She fought wildly, panic erasing all pretense of control. Let me go, Eleanor cried. Please? For a moment, Seraphina hesitated. Not out of mercy, but out of recognition. This woman had been her jailer, her tormentor, her mirror. Ending her would be easy. Ending what she represented would not. Footsteps sounded on the stairs below, voices raised, alarmed. Seraphina released the chain. Eleanor collapsed to the floor, sobbing, clutching her wrist. They are coming, Eleanor gasped. You cannot escape. Seraphina stepped back into the shadows, her voice steady. You already taught me how. The door below burst open. Men shouted. Light flooded the stairwell. When they reached the attic, they found Eleanor alone on the floor, the pistol lying useless beside her. And the chains, still locked, but empty of the woman they had once been meant to hold. Because in the moment Eleanor Whitcomb had chosen fear over truth, she had lost the last thing she possessed. Control. And the house, finally stirred to violence, would not be calmed again without fire. They found the attic empty, but emptiness did not calm anyone. It did the opposite. It turned every shadow in the house into a suspect, every creak of timber into a footstep, every whispered word into a knife. Grady stood in the attic doorway, lantern raised high, staring at the slack chains as if they had betrayed him personally. That ain't possible, he muttered. Eleanor sat on the floor, pressed against a trunk, her wrist red where iron had bitten. Her hair had come loose at the pins, gray strands hanging like thin smoke. She did not look at Grady. She looked past him, down the stairs, as if she expected the house itself to rise up and swallow her. It is possible, she said, voice flat. Because you have all been fools. Grady's jaw tightened. Where did she go? Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the corner where the shadows were deepest. Out. One of the men made the sign of the cross without thinking. Another swallowed hard and forced himself to step into the attic, boots scraping across old boards. He lifted a length of chain and let it fall. The clatter sounded like laughter. She could not have gotten past the stairs, he said. She could, Eleanor whispered. She learned this house the way a rat learns a wall. They argued then, Grady insisting on searches, the men insisting on dogs, Eleanor insisting on silence. She wanted the whole thing folded back into secrecy the way she had folded everything else for 10 years. But secrecy had already begun to leak. Downstairs, voices carried. Doors opened. Servants, free now but still trapped by circumstance, gathered in the hall and pretended not to listen. Ruth stood near the kitchen doorway, her hands shaking. Josiah was beside her, his face carved into something older than anger. "You see," Ruth whispered. "I told you." That door wasn't holding her no more. Josiah did not answer. He stared toward the back stairs, his mind moving through possibilities like fingers through ashes. In the yard outside, a warm wind pushed across the grass. The marsh air smelled sharper than usual, as if something had stirred the mud. Crickets stopped singing, then began again, frantic. Seraphina moved through the house like a thought no one wanted to have. She had not simply stepped past men in the stairwell. She had slipped into spaces she had memorized for years, behind curtains, beneath stair landings, into the narrow servant corridors that white eyes rarely registered. She moved barefoot, feeling the boards for the soft spots that would not betray her weight. The chains were still on her ankles, but she had learned how to walk with them quietly, lifting rather than dragging. At her wrists, iron cuffs remained. A length of chain trailed behind her like a tail. It should have slowed her. It did not. In the kitchen, she paused in the doorway for a single breath. Ruth saw her first. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Seraphina lifted a finger to her own lips. Ruth nodded, tears filling her eyes. Josiah turned slowly and met Seraphina's gaze. The driver's face tightened, part fear, part awe, part grief that had nowhere to go. "You alive?" he whispered. Seraphina's voice was low. "I stayed alive." Josiah stepped closer. "Where are you going?" Seraphina looked toward the back door. "Out of what she built." Ruth found her voice at last, trembling. "They gone hunt you." "They already did," Seraphina said. "For 10 years. Josiah stared at the iron on her. "You need them chains off." Seraphina shook her head once. "Not yet." A shout echoed from the front hall, Grady's voice barking orders. "Search the rooms. Check the pantry. Check the cellar. Nobody leaves." Seraphina listened, calm. "He thinks I am a thing that can be cornered." Josiah's eyes narrowed. "You planning something?" Seraphina did not deny it. "This house is a grave," she said. "Graves need dirt." Ruth flinched. "You talking about burning it?" Seraphina's gaze drifted toward the parlor, toward the polished furniture and heavy drapes that had never belonged to anyone who scrubbed them. "It will burn," she said, as if stating whether. Josiah's throat worked. He thought of Lilla, how she had died 2 winters earlier, eyes fixed on the main house, breath leaving her in a whisper of her daughter's name. He thought of every name in Eleanor's ledgers, every child sold, every woman silenced. He nodded once. "Then do it." Ruth grabbed his sleeve. "Uncle." Josiah looked at her. "Hush, girl. Sometimes the only way out is through fire." Seraphina stepped into the pantry and took what she needed with practiced economy. Lamp oil in a tin, a box of matches, a length of cloth. Her hands did not shake. She had imagined this in darkness so many nights it felt like destiny made physical. Ruth whispered, "Why you doing it?" "Why now?" Seraphina's eyes lifted, dark and steady. "Because she will lock another door," she said. "And I will not leave another soul in the dark." Footsteps thundered in the corridor. Josiah shoved the pantry door nearly closed, blocking the line of sight. Seraphina crouched in shadow, breath held. Grady rushed past with 2 men, not thinking to search the kitchen again. When their voices faded, Seraphina rose. "Go," she told Ruth. "Get anyone you trust out to the quarters. Tell them to stay low." Ruth's lips trembled. "You coming?" Seraphina looked toward the front of the house. "I have one more room to visit." She moved toward Eleanor's study. The door was locked. She listened. Inside, Eleanor sobbed, soft, furious sobs as if even grief offended her pride. Seraphina did not enter. She did not need to. She took the lamp oil, soaked the cloth, and fed it beneath the door, letting it drink. Then she struck a match. The flame caught instantly, hungry. It crawled along the cloth like something alive, slipped under the door, and began licking at paper, wood, old varnish. Seraphina watched for 1 heartbeat, then turned away. By the time Eleanor smelled smoke, it was already too late. "What is that?" Eleanor gasped, rising from the floor in her bedroom. She stumbled into the hall, calling out, voice shrill. "Grady! Grady!" The first scream came from downstairs. Fire. Another followed. "The study's burning." Panic exploded through the house like gunpowder. Men ran. Women shouted. Buckets appeared, then vanished. The wind outside caught the smoke and pulled it greedily through open hallways. Flames climbed curtains, raced up stairwells, found dry wood, and made it confess. Grady bellowed orders that no one could fully obey. Form a line. To the well. Hurry. Eleanor staggered into the hall, eyes wide, hair loose. She looked less like a mistress now and more like a frightened woman waking inside her own punishment. Save the ledgers, she screamed. Save the records. A man shouted back, Ma'am, we can't. The ceiling above the study crackled, then burst into flame. Outside, former field hands gathered at the edge of the yard, watching the main house burn. Some wept. Some stared in silence. Some looked almost relieved. Josiah stood among them, Ruth beside him, both breathing hard. Where's she at? Ruth whispered. Josiah's gaze tracked the shadows near the back of the house. Seraphina appeared there briefly, half-lit by orange firelight, chains glinting like a crown of iron. She did not run like someone fleeing. She walked like someone leaving a funeral. Then the smoke swallowed her. By midnight, Whitcomb Plantation's main house was an inferno visible from the marsh. Flames roared through the upper floors, collapsing beams with thunderous finality. The air smelled of burning pine, scorched cloth, and something older, paper, ink, the brittle ghosts of records turning to ash. Eleanor Whitcomb was dragged into the yard, coughing, face streaked with soot. She watched the house die and made a sound that did not quite qualify as sobbing. It was closer to mourning, though whether she mourned the house, the power, or her own unraveling no one could say. What they did not know, what none of them understood in that moment, was that the fire was not merely destruction. It was erasure. And erasure in a world built on written proof could be a kind of freedom. Because by dawn the house would be rubble, and Seraphina would be gone. By the time the sun rose over the marsh, the Whitcomb house was no longer a house. It was a skeleton of blackened beams and collapsed roofs, steaming softly in the damp morning air as if the fire itself were reluctant to let go. Ash drifted across the yard like gray snow. It settled on faces, on hands, on grass that had never been allowed to grow tall. It settled in Eleanor Whitcomb's hair as she stood wrapped in a blanket, staring at what remained of her life. Grady approached her cautiously, his own clothes smelling of smoke and sweat. Ma'am, he began, voice low. We ought to send word. Folks will ask questions. Eleanor's eyes were dry. She had cried everything out in the night, and what remained now was harder than grief. Yes, she said. They will ask. Grady swallowed. What do we tell them? Eleanor looked at him then, truly looked, and he flinched at the coldness he found. It was not shock, not confusion. It was calculation. Eleanor Whitcomb could lose a house and still cling to the one thing she had always valued above comfort. Control of the story. We tell them the truth, Eleanor said softly. Grady blinked. Ma'am? Eleanor's mouth tightened. A version of it. She turned her gaze back to the smoking ruins. The war ruined our finances. The house was old. A stray lamp. A careless servant. That is all anyone needs. Grady hesitated. Harlan. Eleanor's jaw clenched. He fell, she said. An accident. A man snooping where he had no right. Do you want his family here demanding explanations? Grady shook his head quickly. Eleanor's voice sharpened. Then you will tell them what I tell you to tell them. He nodded. By noon, riders had been sent. By evening, neighbors arrived, stepping carefully around ash and charred debris, speaking in hushed tones as if they had come to a funeral where the corpse might still hear them. How terrible, one woman murmured, covering her mouth with a gloved hand. Eleanor, you poor thing. Eleanor inclined her head, receiving sympathy like a queen receiving tribute. It was God's will, she said. A trial. Men walked through the rubble, poking at burnt furniture, murmuring about insurance and rebuilding costs. Someone asked where the servants had gone. Someone asked whether any valuables were saved. Eleanor answered each question with practiced restraint. No one asked about the attic. Not directly. But the question hovered behind their eyes, behind the way some of them glanced toward the upper remains of the stairwell. Rumors had reached them. Everyone in that county had heard whispers about locked doors. About a beautiful enslaved girl who vanished. About Eleanor Whitcomb's delicate health. Eleanor watched their faces and understood something bitterly. They were afraid of being implicated even by association. They did not want truth. They wanted reassurance that their own houses were not next. So Eleanor gave them reassurance. She ran off years ago, Eleanor said when one bold neighbor finally asked carefully about the girl. Ran? The man repeated, eyebrows raised. Yes, Eleanor said smoothly. A foolish thing. We searched. We failed. Such tragedies happen in unsettled times. It was a lie, and everyone knew it was a lie, but lies that protected the powerful were often treated like manners. "And the chains?" someone whispered later, thinking Eleanor would not hear. Eleanor heard everything. She turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing. "Chains are tools," she said. "Tools can be misused. My house is proof of that." The sentence sounded like confession, but it was not. It was a warning. She was telling them to stop asking. They did. Within a week, the county clerk recorded the fire as an accident. Within a month, the story had settled into a familiar shape. A proud plantation mistress ruined by war and misfortune, her estate reduced to ash. Some said it was punishment from God. Others said it was simply bad luck. The official record did not mention Seraphina. It did not mention the attic. It did not mention that a man had died with iron around his throat. Those details stayed in mouths, not ink, passed quietly between people who understood that paper could be used against you. But stories, told carefully, could keep truth alive without exposing it. In the quarters, what used to be the quarters, people spoke Seraphina's name like a prayer. "She did it," Ruth said one night, voice hushed. "She burned it all." Josiah nodded. "She burned the proof." Ruth hugged her knees, staring into the dark. "Where's she go?" Josiah's gaze drifted toward the marsh, where mist rose at dusk like breath from the earth. "Somewhere she can breathe." Not everyone believed she escaped. Some claimed she drowned in the swamp, weighed down by chains. Others swore they saw a woman walking along the tree line at dawn, iron clinking softly, her silhouette lit by firelight like a saint carved from shadow. One man said he saw Eleanor Whitcomb standing alone on the ruined foundation, speaking softly into the air as if answering someone invisible. "Who you talking to?" he asked her, half joking. Eleanor's eyes cut toward him. "Myself," she replied. "The only person who ever listened." But at night, when no one was near, Eleanor sometimes stood with her hands clenched at her sides and stared toward the marsh, listening. She heard nothing. And that terrified her more than sound ever had. Because silence, after 10 years, felt like a door finally closing. And Eleanor Whitcomb knew, though she would never admit it, that the girl she had locked away had not simply escaped. She had erased Eleanor's life the way Eleanor had tried to erase hers. What they did not know, what the county could not record, was that the fire had done more than destroy a house. It had burned away Eleanor's illusion that power could last forever. And now, with the records turned to ash, Seraphina's story belonged to the only place it had ever truly belonged, the mouths of the living, and the memories of the dead. In the years that followed the fire, Whitcomb Plantation did not recover. It could not. Rebuilding required money, labor, and belief in a future that looked like the past. Eleanor Whitcomb possessed none of those things anymore. She lived out her days in a smaller house near town, surrounded by furniture that smelled faintly of smoke no matter how often it was polished. People were polite to her. Politeness was easier than truth. They called her poor Eleanor and spoke of the war as if it were a storm that had singled her out unfairly. She let them. What she did not let them see was how the nights undid her. Sleep came in fragments. She woke often, certain she had heard iron shift across wood. Sometimes she reached for a bell that was no longer there. Other times she sat upright in bed, heart racing, convinced she was no longer alone. "You cannot hurt me now," she whispered once into the dark. The dark did not answer. But Eleanor knew better than to believe silence meant absence. Out in the marsh, stories took root. A fisherman swore he saw a woman at dawn, standing knee-deep in water, chains glinting like jewelry, her face turned toward the rising sun. A midwife claimed a stranger helped her deliver a child in a cabin far from town, then vanished before she could give thanks. A man fleeing debt said a woman guided him through fog so thick he could not see his own hands, her voice calm, instructive, impossible to disobey. Some said the woman never aged. Others said she aged backward, growing younger with each passing year, as if time itself were being repaid. No one wrote these stories down. They did not need to. Josiah lived long enough to see the world tilt in ways he never thought possible. He watched men who had once carried whips now bargain for work. He watched women choose names for themselves instead of answering to the ones written in ledgers. And sometimes, standing at the edge of the marsh, he felt a presence pass behind him, quiet, purposeful. "She free," he said once, smiling faintly to himself. However that look. Ruth grew older too. She married. She had children. On nights when the wind rattled the shutters, she told them stories, not fairy tales, not exactly. Stories about listening, about patience, about how cages built from fear eventually collapsed under their own weight. She never used Seraphina's name out loud with them. Names had power. But she taught them what the name meant. Eleanor Whitcomb died in the winter of 1878. The notice in the paper was brief. respectable. It spoke of her as a woman of standing, of losses borne with dignity. It did not mention chains. It did not mention fire. At the end, Eleanor asked for a mirror. The servant hesitated. "Ma'am?" "I wish to see myself," Eleanor said. When the mirror was brought, Eleanor studied her reflection for a long time. Her face was thin now, her eyes sunken, her hair white. She looked at last like someone who had lived with ghosts. "I was afraid," she whispered to the glass. "That is all." The mirror did not argue. After her death, her remaining possessions were sold. Trunks opened. Drawers emptied. No one found records worth keeping. The ledgers had burned just as Seraphina intended. History, deprived of ink, had to rely on memory. And memory, unlike paper, had room for truth. Years later, decades later, a historian traveling the Georgia coast would note an unusual pattern in local folklore. Stories of a chained woman. Stories of a burning house. Stories that contradicted official accounts in quiet but persistent ways. "Probably exaggerated," he wrote in the margin of his notebook. Wishful thinking. But even he paused at the consistency of the details. 10 years. Chains. An attic. A fire. A woman who walked away. Whether Seraphina lived the rest of her life in peace, or whether she disappeared into legend entirely, no one could say for certain. Perhaps she shed the iron and took a new name. Perhaps she carried the sound of chains with her always, a reminder of what had been survived. What is certain is this: she was not erased. Eleanor Whitcomb tried to bury her in darkness. Instead, she forged her. And in doing so, Eleanor ensured that her own name would fade into footnotes, while Seraphina's story, unwritten, unapproved, uncontained, would endure where it mattered most. In the quiet places. In the spaces between official lines. In the long memory of people who understood that survival itself could be an act of defiance. Because beauty, once caged, did not wither. Learn how to burn. What do you think really happened to Seraphina after the fire? Did she disappear into the marsh, or did she live out her life quietly under another name? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more dark historical stories that blur the line between truth and legend, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Share this story with someone who believes forgotten voices deserve to be heard. These stories matter. These lives mattered. And we will keep telling them.